So in the process of tuning a brand new Japanese plane, I've now lapped the back of the blade flat and I am ready to sharpen the bevel. The bevels of Japanese tools can vary greatly from factory to factory and manufacturer to manufacturer. Often they are domed in the middle. Often they're not. So I have no idea what's going to happen with this plane, so I'm going to put this blade onto a Waterstone and sharpen it and see what's going on. Really important that our stones are nice and flat. You can use you can use whatever abrasive method you prefer in the sharpening of a plane blade. I like to use Waterstones because they are awesome, but you don't have to. So in flattening a Waterstone, I've just knocked it back with a 400 grit Atoma plate, and I can be confident that that is nice and flat. So freehand sharpening, if you're going to freehand sharpen any tool, try it with your Japanese plane. You've got such a large piece of steel and such a huge bevel area that you stand a really good chance of keeping it nice and flat on the stone. Really good way to practice your hand sharpening because it's very forgiving in many ways. However, we need to establish a flat. So what I'm going to do, instead of going straight on like this, I'm going to switch my plane blade to perpendicular to the stone, and I'm going to work across it. What this allows me to do is it really stabilizes the blade in the direction of my pressure so that I can push forward and backwards, and I can be confident that it's going to stay quite flat on the stone. I need to make sure that I know what's going on. So here on this blade, what we can see is that I've got a high point right in the middle. I've hit that high point, but the edges have not been touched. So I need to work this bevel until my edges are touching. Here on this left-hand side, looks like it's going to come in fairly quickly. This right-hand side has further to go, a longer distance, and therefore it's going to take the longest. Really important that I knock it all down evenly. So if I've got a lot of work to do, I can step down in grit as well. This is a 1000 grit Waterstone. I could easily step down to an 800, a 600, even a 320 sort of grit Waterstone in order to speed up this process. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. This is a 320 grit Waterstone. Keeping a coarse Waterstone flat is actually more work than keeping a fine Waterstone flat. A coarser Waterstone is generally softer, and because it's more aggressive, it's really important to keep it nice and flat because this is where we establish our geometry. So with a number of passes, well, that's just 2 minutes on the 320 grit stone, I'm now very, very close to hitting both corners of my blade. However, I don't want to keep sharpening on this 320 grit stone until I'm confident that it's flat again. So with only a couple of minutes work on the 320, I'm going to knock it back again. So after about 10 minutes on the 320 grit stone, it now appears that I've touched corner to corner on the blade. I think that a little bit of this will be a lie because I can also see that the light is rolling on and off the blade nicely front to back, but it also hangs around slightly on one of the sides. So I think that one of these sides has a slight roll, and if I've just followed that roll enough with my hand as I've sharpened on the 320, I've got the finish of the 320, but not necessarily the geometry I want. With Japanese plane blades though, we can use this to our advantage if we want a smoothing plane. So a smoothing plane does not have a dead flat edge. As with Western planes, we want to gently curve the corners of the blade back so that when we take a pass on a large piece of timber, we don't leave a train track, we don't leave a hard edge of our blade. We want to blend that blade out back into the body of our plane so that our cut is smoothed out as well. To the naked eye, we can't detect the difference between where these various smoothing plane cuts are going to be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the 1000 grit stone. And it is just as I suspected. We have a nice finish across most of the blade. The last 8 mil is still showing the 320 grit finish, so that last 8 mil is slightly low. And on this side, probably the last 1 mil is slightly low as well. So we've got a flat area in the middle with a low point on one side and a slight low point on the other. So I'm going to work this and try and bring it back and try and get this as close as I can to flat across the blade, but I'm also accepting that I'm going to have a little roll either side. I'm going to use that to my advantage. Another little tip about sharpening Japanese plane blades is that we have a hard high carbon steel in the front and a soft low carbon steel on the back. So if I were to take this pass here, like so, I can feel really good about sharpening. I feel like it's all flat on the stone, and I've got lots of black steel coming out the front of my blade, but this black area is correlating to the soft steel on the back of the blade and is not actually touching the hard high carbon steel at the front. What I need to do is need to make sure that my pressure is going through my fingers into the hard high carbon steel edge. And this isn't necessarily an issue of hand positioning, so much an issue of mentally reminding my body to put the pressure through the front. And you can see that once I've got the pressure through the front, that hard high carbon steel abrades in a much darker colour. It feels skippier because it's harder, and it also sounds different. So the sound on the stone is slightly different as well. But these are things to bear in mind because it'd be quite hard to get your edge if you're putting all your effort into the back of the blade. We need to make sure that our effort's going into the front. I'm playing around with a few of my techniques here on the stone. So if you're aiming for ultimate aggression, what you're looking for is distance across the stone, because that gives you more abrasives that you're encountering. However, if you're aiming for control, smaller, more accurate strokes are probably preferable. So if I'm starting out sharpening, and I still consider myself a beginner in many ways, I would say that dividing the stone into small areas and working those areas one portion at a time is a much easier way to learn sharpening and develop muscle memory, because you've got a lot of control with the swing of your arms only being quite short. You're only changing your geometry so much as you go. If you're feeling quite comfortable with your sharpening, distance along the stone gives you a more aggressive cut and will speed up your sharpening. However, because your arms are traveling much further with a larger range of movement, there are more opportunities to introduce errors in geometry. So that is something to think about and keep in mind and experiment with. So after establishing a nice, sharp, flat bevel, I've actually got a burr all along the back. I can run my finger up the back of the blade and feel a slight tickle on my finger. I just want to make sure that I can roll these corners, not roll these corners, but sharpen these corners slightly on an angle, or just more pressure. And what that's going to allow me to do is make sure that as I take my cuts, I'm not getting that train track, that hard edge. I'm blending out the blade back into the block. I'm going very light on that process at the moment because I want to really see how it's going to perform in the block, and probably on the second sharpening, if I want that to be more exaggerated, I can exaggerate it further. But with that, I'm going to go up through the grits. This is a 1000 grit stone. I'm going to do a 3000 grit stone, and I'm going to finish on an 8000 grit stone. With a plain blade, I encourage you to go as high as you can, use the highest grit stone you have. If you can only go to 3000, go to 3000. But because I have an 8, I'm going to go to an 8. So I've now worked my way through the 3000 grit stone for about 5 minutes. It's fairly solid sharpening. I've got a nice 3000 grit finish on my edge, and I'm finishing on the 8. Up until this point, I have not touched the back of my blade to any Waterstone. The reason for that is that I spent a good amount of time getting it really nice and polished on a cunnerbun and really nice and flat. Up until my finest stone, anything I do on a Waterstone would have actually taken away from my initial work. So I've got a little burr off the 3000 grit, and I can deburr, keeping it nice and flat on the 8000 grit stone. I've flattened this stone before I started, and I'm going to just take another deburring pass. And this way, by only working on my finer stone, which is also my hardest stone, making sure it's nice and flat, I can make sure that I'm not losing any of the benefit of the work I've done earlier. I also, because I've got a nice polish, I don't want to affect the polish with a coarse stone, and keeping it nice and fine is going to only refine my polish. There we go. So finishing off, I've deburred, I've sharpened, and I've deburred, and I've got a nice fine finish across my edge. There's a few ways you can test your plane sharpness. You can take some hairs off your arm, which is all well and good, but people start to look at you funny in the street. If you do it too much, you can shave some paper, or you can take a little chip of wood off the end of a piece of scrap to test the sharpness. But I'm very happy with that. That looks to me like a really nice sharp blade with a flat back, good bevel, and I can now move on to fitting that blade to the block.